The year was 1812, and the air crackled with a tension that had little to do with the approaching Russian winter and everything to do with the singular, world-altering ambition of one man, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, whose Grande Armée, a force of over 500,000 men drawn from every corner of his empire and representing a multitude of languages, uniforms, and dreams, stood poised on the banks of the Niemen River, a living, breathing monument to power that stretched as far as the eye could see, a colossal organism of men, horses, and cannon whose very presence seemed to make the earth tremble underfoot, their collective breath misting in the chill of a June that felt unnervingly like October, a portent none could yet decipher. This was not merely an army, it was a nation on the march, a traveling city of cooks, smiths, cartographers, surgeons, wives, and entertainers trailing in its wake, all moving with an inexorable momentum towards the vast, unknown expanse of Russia, a land that offered only two things in abundance: space and silence, two enemies against which even the most brilliant military tactics were useless. Among this multitude was a young, idealistic conscript from the sun-drenched vineyards of Languedoc named Pierre Moreau, who, despite the grand speeches about crushing the Tsar and securing continental hegemony, carried with him a simple, aching hope to see the onion-domed churches of Moscow, to write home to his fiancée, Elise, of the strange beauty of the East, and to return a hero. His pockets full of stories and his heart full of glory, a hope that shone brightly in his eyes even as the veterans around him grumbled about the thin soup and the strangely persistent cold. The crossing of the Niemen was not a battle but a spectacle, a display of such overwhelming force that it seemed to suck the sound from the world, the only noise the rhythmic, earth-shaking tread of booted feet on pontoon bridges, the snorting of impatient horses, and the occasional, muffled order from an officer, the Russian scouts on the far bank merely watching, a shadowy, silent presence that melted back into the endless forests as the immense host advanced, a tactic of retreat and abandonment that was both baffling and deeply unsettling to the French commanders who expected a grand, decisive engagement. For weeks, the Grande Armée pushed deeper into the heart of Russia, and the land itself seemed to conspire against them. The summer heat, when it finally arrived, was oppressive and dusty, choking men and beasts alike. The promised supplies never materialized as the Russian scorched earth policy left behind only smoldering villages and empty fields. And the relentless marching over impossible distances began to wear down even the most disciplined units, stretching supply lines to a gossamer thread and turning the mighty army into a long, vulnerable snake slowly starving in a barren land. Pierre, his bright uniform now faded and coated in a fine layer of gray dust, found his dreams of adventure replaced by the grim reality of blistered feet, an eternally empty stomach, and the constant, low-grade fear that came with entering a country that did not want you and seemed willing to simply disappear around you, its people vanished like ghosts, its resources hidden, its immense spaces offering no landmarks. Only a disorienting, featureless horizon that played tricks on the mind. The first major encounter, the Battle of Smolensk, was a brutal, bloody affair fought over a burning city, a Pyrrhic victory that cost the French dearly and yielded nothing of strategic value, the Russian army once again slipping away to the east, always just out of reach, luring them deeper into the trap of geography. And it was in the smoldering ruins of Smolensk that Pierre first heard the whispers. The campfire tales passed between grizzled sergeants and wide-eyed new recruits about the thing that stalked the deep forests that pressed in on either side of the army's line of march, a thing that was not Russian nor Cossack nor any kind of man. They spoke of a mist, a cold, silent fog that seemed to move with a purpose of its own, independent of the wind, a mist that was unnaturally white and thick, and those who were caught on the periphery of the marching column, those who strayed just a few yards to answer the call of nature or to forage for a missed turnip, would sometimes vanish into it without a sound, their absence noted only hours later. Their names added to the growing roll call of the missing, attributed to desertion or Cossack raids. But the veterans knew better, their superstitious whispers speaking of a silence so absolute it felt like a physical blow to the ears, a cold that burned the skin, and a feeling of being watched by something ancient and utterly indifferent. Pierre dismissed it as the ramblings of exhausted, frightened men, a folktale born of hardship and the strange, oppressive atmosphere of this endless land, but a seed of doubt was planted, a cold knot of fear in his gut that tightened every time the evening mists began to rise from the damp ground, shrouding the endless birch forests in a spectral veil. The army pressed on, its numbers dwindling from disease, desertion, and the constant, harrying attacks of Cossack cavalry that appeared from nowhere and vanished just as quickly, leaving behind bleeding, dying men and a deeper sense of paranoia, until finally, in mid-September, they reached the gates of Moscow, not as a triumphant conquering force but as a ragged, hungry, and exhausted mob. Their victory hollow as they entered a city that was, like everything else in Russia, abandoned, its streets empty, its silence more terrifying than any defending army. Then the fires began, set by Russian patriots and fanned by a cruel wind, and for 3 days Moscow burned, a holocaust of flame that turned the city into an oven, destroying the precious supplies the army had desperately hoped to find and symbolically burning Napoleon's dream of a quick victory to ashes, the men now not conquerors but refugees surrounded by a sea of fire. Their faces smudged with soot and etched with the dawning realization of their utter hopelessness. It was during this chaos, as Pierre helped a company of his comrades form a bucket brigade to save a crucial storehouse, that he saw it for the first time, on the edge of the fiery maelstrom, in a narrow, smoke-filled alleyway where the sounds of the inferno were oddly muted, a wall of that same white, cold mist the old soldiers had whispered about, just standing there, motionless against the raging heat, a silent, impassive observer to the destruction, and for a terrifying second, Pierre thought he saw shapes moving within it, tall, impossibly thin silhouettes that seemed to absorb the light around them rather than reflect it, a vision that lasted only a heartbeat before a collapsing roof sent him scrambling for safety. The image seared into his mind, making him question his own sanity. The decision to retreat from Moscow in October was a death sentence, an admission of catastrophic failure that condemned the Grande Armée to a march back through a country already stripped bare, now blanketed in the early snows of a brutal winter that arrived with a vengeful fury, the temperature plummeting to degrees these men from temperate Europe could not even comprehend, turning the retreat into a frozen nightmare of suffering and death. This was no longer a military campaign. It was a slow, agonizing dissolution of a world power, a descent into a primal struggle for survival where discipline broke down and men fought each other for a crust of frozen bread or a place near a meager fire, the once proud regiments dissolving into a desperate, shambling mob of freezing, starving wraiths, their uniforms in tatters, their eyes vacant with a horror that went beyond the physical torment. And it was here, on this frozen road to hell, that the whispers returned, stronger now, fed by the collective delirium of a dying army. The mist was back, but it was no longer just taking stragglers. It was following them, keeping pace with the shattered remnants of the corps, a silent, spectral predator herding its prey, and men began to speak of the white silence, a thing that consumed not just bodies, but sound, hope, and memory itself. Pierre, clinging to life by a thread, his feet wrapped in bloody rags, his body shivering uncontrollably, saw it more frequently now, always at the edges of the column, a wall of white at the tree line, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always present, a constant, watching presence that the Cossacks, those masters of the winter steppe, seemed to fear as well, for they gave the strange mist a wide berth. Their attacks ceasing whenever it drew near, their faces pale with a superstitious dread that mirrored that of the French. The army, or what was left of it, reached the Berezina River in late November, a choked, frozen nightmare of a crossing where bridges collapsed under the weight of panicked men and cannon, and thousands drowned in the icy waters or were trampled to death in the stampede, a scene of such utter human misery that it defied description. And it was here, in the midst of this apocalyptic chaos, that the event which would birth the legend occurred, an event that Pierre witnessed and that would haunt his every waking moment for the rest of his days. Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, was attempting to form a rearguard of the few hundred coherent soldiers left to hold off the Russian pursuit and allow the shattered central column to cross, a suicide mission that every man accepted with a grim, numb resignation, and Pierre, finding a last reservoir of strength from some deep, unknown well, stood with them, his musket frozen to his hands, his world narrowed to the next breath. The next step, the next moment of life, the Russian artillery began to find its range, and shells started to fall among them, adding to the carnage, and then a particularly dense bank of the strange white mist, thicker and colder than any before, began to roll across the battlefield from the northern forest, moving against the wind, its advance silent and inexorable, and as it enveloped the first Russian battery, the shelling from that position stopped abruptly. Not with the sound of an explosion or screams, but with a silence so profound it was more terrifying than the noise of battle. The mist swept over no man's land and then reached the French rearguard, and Pierre felt a cold unlike any winter chill, a cold that seized the lungs and stopped the heart, a cold that felt alive, and the world around him went utterly, impossibly silent. The roar of the river, the screams of the dying, the crash of musketry, all were extinguished as if they had never been, replaced by a ringing void that was somehow a sound in itself. A sound of absolute nothingness. He could see the men around him, their mouths open in screams he could not hear, their eyes wide with a terror that mirrored his own, and then the mist closed in, so thick he could not see his own hand in front of his face, and he felt a sensation of being lifted, of moving, not of his own volition, but pulled, drawn away from the world he knew, the cold so intense it became a burning sensation, and his last conscious thought was of Elise's face. Back in the sunlit vineyards of Languedoc, a memory that was suddenly ripped from his mind, leaving only a blank, white emptiness. When consciousness returned, it was not the gentle return of a waking dream but a sudden, violent reinstatement of reality. The sounds of the battle crashing back in, the screams, the roar of the Berezina, the distant thunder of cannon. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. The mist was gone, vanished as if it had never been, and the sky above was clear and cold. Pierre pushed himself up, his body aching with a deep, core cold, and looked around. The Russian bombardment had ceased. The attacking infantry had stopped their advance and were staring, dumbfounded, across the field. Pierre turned to look at his comrades, the brave few hundred who had formed the rearguard with Marshal Ney, and his blood ran colder than the Berezina's ice. They were gone. Not dead. Not retreated. Gone. Marshal Ney, the officers, the hundreds of men, vanished. The ground where they had stood was empty, untouched, not a single footprint, not a dropped musket, not a shred of evidence that anyone had ever been there. It was as if they had been neatly, precisely, and completely erased from existence. Pierre was alone, standing in a field of snow, the only survivor of a vanishing that defied all logic and reason, the sole witness to the mystery of the vanishing army that never returned from 1812. He stood there, a solitary and insignificant figure amidst the vast, white expanse of the snow-covered field. The silence that had replaced the thunderous chaos of moments before now feeling heavier and more oppressive than any noise could ever be, a profound void that seemed to swallow the very concept of sound itself, leaving behind only the frantic, hammering rhythm of his own heart thudding against his ribs, a desperate drumbeat of life in a landscape that had just demonstrated a terrifying capacity for absolute erasure. The Russians on the far side of the field, those hardened soldiers of the Tsar who had faced down cannon fire and cavalry charges without flinching, now wore expressions of superstitious dread, crossing themselves fervently and backing away from the inexplicable emptiness where hundreds of men had just been standing, their advance halted not by French steel but by a phenomenon that defied all understanding. A miracle or a curse that left them more terrified than any army could, and soon they began to retreat, melting back into the tree line as if fleeing an invisible plague, leaving Pierre utterly alone on the silent battlefield, the only living soul for miles around, a witness to an event so monumental and so horrifying that his mind, already frayed by months of starvation, cold, and terror, threatened to unravel completely, teetering on the precipice of a madness that promised the sweet relief of oblivion. He stumbled forward, his frozen boots crunching in the snow, the sound absurdly loud in the absolute quiet, his eyes scanning the pristine, unmarked powder where Marshal Ney's rearguard had made their last stand, expecting at any moment to find a dropped shako, a broken musket, a bloodstain, anything to prove that what he had seen was not real, that it was a hallucination born of extreme exhaustion and hunger. But there was nothing. Not a single scuff mark or disturbed patch of snow. The ground was a perfect, smooth blanket of white, as if a divine hand had gently pressed down upon the earth, extinguishing those hundreds of lives without leaving even the faintest impression, a cleanliness that was more horrifying than any carnage he had witnessed at Smolensk or the Berezina crossings. The sheer impossibility of it, the violation of every natural law, struck him with a physical force, and he fell to his knees, vomiting a thin, bitter bile onto the snow, his body convulsing with sobs that made no sound, the trauma of the event too vast for tears, his mind replaying those last moments on an endless, hellish loop, the advancing wall of silent, cold white. The looks of abject terror on the faces of his comrades, the sensation of being lifted and torn from reality itself, and then nothing, followed by this emptiness, this silence, this utter aloneness. He didn't know how long he knelt there, his mind adrift in a sea of shock, but the gradually fading light of the short winter day finally spurred him into a desperate, animalistic instinct for survival. To stay here was to die, to freeze solid and become just another anonymous corpse in this vast graveyard of an empire. And so, with the effort that seemed to drain the very last of his soul, he pushed himself upright, his muscles screaming in protest, and began to move, not towards the ruined bridges of the Berezina where the last dregs of the Grande Army were still fighting and dying, but away, southwards, following the course of the frozen river, his only thought to put as much distance as possible between himself and that cursed field, to flee the memory of the mist and the silence that had stolen an army. He walked for what felt like an eternity, the cold seeping deeper into his bones with every step, the images of the vanishing haunting his every waking moment, his hunger a dull, constant ache, his thirst so severe he resorted to scooping handfuls of snow into his mouth, knowing it would lower his body temperature further but unable to resist the primal need for moisture. The landscape was a monochrome nightmare of white snow and black, skeletal trees, offering no shelter, no comfort, no sign of life, and he soon lost all sense of time and direction, becoming just another lost soul wandering in the frozen wastes, his past life in Languedoc feeling like a dream belonging to another person, a distant, sun-drenched memory that had no power here in this present hell. He was on the verge of collapse, his vision blurring, his legs refusing to obey his commands, when he stumbled upon a sight that seemed like a mirage, a small, dilapidated woodcutter's hut, half buried in a drift, its roof sagging but still offering the promise of shelter from the biting wind. With the last of his strength, he crawled inside, the interior dark and smelling of old pine needles and animal droppings, but blessedly out of the elements, and he collapsed into a heap on the hard dirt floor, slipping immediately into a deep, exhausted, and troubled sleep filled with nightmares of silent white voids and screaming faces that made no sound. He was awoken hours later not by the cold, but by a sound, the first he had heard in what felt like a lifetime, the soft crackle of a fire. Blinking open his crusted eyes, he saw a figure huddled over a small, carefully built blaze in the hearth. An old man with a face like weathered leather and eyes that held the deep, weary knowledge of the forest. A man who said nothing, merely nodding at Pierre and handing him a wooden bowl containing a thin, hot broth made from melted snow and a few scraps of dried meat. The warmth of the food and the fire was a shock to Pierre's system, bringing feeling back to his frozen limbs in a painful, prickling rush. And as he ate, the old man finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, speaking in a heavily accented but understandable French, asking no questions about Pierre's uniform or how he came to be here, as if lost French soldiers were a common occurrence in his hut. When Pierre, his voice hoarse and unused, finally choked out his story, not the entire epic of the retreat from Moscow, but the specific, horrifying event on the field by the Berezina, describing the white mist and the utter disappearance of the men, the old man's face grew grim, and he nodded slowly, as if hearing a confirmation of a dreaded old tale. "The Beloy Malchanai," the old man whispered, the words sounding like a curse, his eyes fixed on the flames. "The white silence. It is old, older than the Tsars, older than the first villages. It does not belong to this world. It is a hunger, a emptiness that seeks to fill itself. It takes, and it does not give back. In the deep winter, when the world is quietest, it grows strong. It listens for the noise of men, for their chaos, and it comes to silence them, to make them part of its nothingness. Your army, it made much noise, yes? Much fire, much shouting, much death. It was a feast for the silence." He told Pierre that the legends were ancient, folktales told to children to scare them into being quiet during the long winter nights, stories of a force of nature that was neither good nor evil, but simply was, a predator that fed on sound and life and memory, that could wipe a trapper's cabin from the face of the earth leaving no trace, or make an entire village vanish, their homes standing empty and untouched as if they had never been inhabited. The peasants feared it above all things, above wolves, above bears, above even the tax collectors of the Tsar, for there was no defense against it, no prayer that could ward it off, only a hope that it would pass you by, that your little patch of the world would be too quiet, too insignificant, to attract its attention. The old man's words, spoken in the flickering firelight of the remote hut, did not calm Pierre's terror. They codified it, gave it a name and a history, transforming his experience from a singular, insane event into something that was part of the very fabric of this cruel land, a natural law of this place that was as real and as deadly as the winter cold. He had not imagined it. It was real. And the army, Marshal Ney, his comrades, they were gone, truly and completely, consumed by a hunger he could not comprehend. This knowledge settled upon him like a lead weight, a burden of truth that was heavier than any pack he had carried on the long march to Moscow. He was not just a survivor of a disastrous campaign. He was a survivor of something else entirely, something ancient and unknowable, and he knew then, with a chilling certainty, that his journey was not over, that simply escaping Russia would not be enough, for how could he ever return to the sun-drenched vineyards of Languedoc, to Elise, and speak of this? Who would ever believe him? He would be branded a madman, a deserter spinning fantastical tales to cover his own cowardice. The truth of the vanishing army had chosen him as its sole witness, and it was a truth that isolated him more completely than any Siberian prison camp ever could. As he sat there, staring into the flames, the old man watching him with pitying eyes, Pierre Moreau understood that his life had been divided into two distinct halves, the time before the silence, and the time after it, and the man he had been was as gone as the vanished army, leaving behind only this hollowed-out shell, a keeper of a secret that could never be told, beginning a long, lonely journey homeward. A journey that felt less like a return and more like an exile into a world that could never again understand what he had seen and what he now knew to be true, a truth that would forever haunt him, the truth of the white silence. The truth of the white silence, a knowledge that felt less like a memory and more like a permanent stain upon his very soul, settled into the marrow of Pierre's bones as he left the woodcutter's hut the next morning, the old man having shared a meager portion of his own scarce supplies. A hunk of black bread, a strip of tough dried meat, and pointing him with a gnarled finger towards the southwest, towards the distant, almost mythical safety of Prussia, a journey of hundreds of miles through a frozen, hostile land that seemed to stretch into infinity, a gauntlet of hunger, cold, and the ever-present, whispering fear that the Beloy Molchanai was not finished with him, that it had left him alive not out of mercy but for some darker, more inscrutable purpose. A single witness to carry the echo of its terrible power out into the world, a living testament to its existence. Every shadow between the skeletal birch trees seemed to hold a deeper darkness. Every gust of wind that moaned through the branches sounded like a faint, ethereal sigh, and every time a bank of perfectly natural fog rose from a frozen stream or a snow-laden hollow, Pierre's heart would clench in a vice of primal terror, his breath catching in his throat, his body freezing mid-step as he waited for the world to once again be wiped away into that absolute, sound-devouring whiteness, the old woodcutter's words echoing in his mind. It is a hunger, a emptiness that seeks to fill itself. He became a creature of pure instinct, moving by day and hiding by night, scavenging for anything edible, frozen berries still clinging to thorny bushes, the occasional abandoned cache of root vegetables from a field picked over by 1,000 other starving men, once even fighting a mangy wolf for the half-frozen carcass of a hare, winning the desperate battle through sheer, crazed desperation and consuming the raw, stringy meat with a feral hunger that shamed the civilized man he once was. He avoided all signs of human habitation, for the sight of smoke from a chimney no longer promised warmth and community but potential betrayal, as the local peasants, themselves pushed to the brink by the war's devastation, were just as likely to turn over a lone French straggler to the Cossacks for a reward or simply out of bitter hatred as they were to offer aid. And the memory of the old woodcutter's unexpected kindness felt like a miraculous anomaly, a single flickering candle in an overwhelming darkness of human cruelty and indifference. The further he trudged, the more the landscape itself began to tell the story of the Grande Armée's annihilation. The road, or what passed for it, became a grotesque gallery of death, littered with the frozen, snow-drifted corpses of men and horses, their bodies contorted in final agonies, their eyes picked clean by crows, their valuables and uniforms long since stripped away by scavengers, both animal and human. A seemingly endless funerary procession that stretched to the horizon, each frozen statue a silent accusation, a reminder of the hubris that had brought them here and the elemental fury that had destroyed them. Pierre walked through this hellscape like a ghost among ghosts, his own suffering mirrored in the glassy eyes of the dead, their faces etched with the same stories of hunger, cold, and despair that now defined his own existence, and he felt a perverse sense of kinship with these frozen sentinels, wondering if perhaps it would have been a kinder fate to have fallen here, to have his body remain in the world, rather than to have been taken by the silence, erased so completely that not even a memory remained in the physical universe. It was on the 8th day of his solitary exodus, as he picked his way through a destroyed village that had been burned to the ground during the initial advance months ago, its blackened timbers poking through the snow like the ribs of a giant carcass, that he stumbled upon the first evidence that he was not, in fact, entirely alone in his knowledge of the event, seeking shelter from a biting wind in the shell of a collapsed smithy. He found a body, not frozen but recently deceased, a French sapper still wearing the tattered remnants of his uniform, a man who had clearly died of his wounds, a ugly, infected gash on his leg having finally claimed him. Driven by a morbid need for any useful supplies, Pierre approached the body, and noticed that the man's hand was clenched tightly around something, his fingers frozen solid in their final grip. With a sense of reverence, Pierre pried the stiff fingers apart, and found not a weapon or a piece of food, but a small, leather-bound journal, its pages smudged with dirt and blood. Sitting in the relative shelter of the ruined wall, his numb fingers struggling to turn the pages, Pierre began to read, and the words he found there sent a fresh wave of ice through his veins that had nothing to do with the temperature. The journal belonged to a Corporal Jacques Lefebvre, an engineer in Ney's own 3 Corps, and it was not just a record of the campaign, it was a detailed, increasingly frantic log of the very phenomena Pierre had witnessed. Lefebvre had been a man of science, a rationalist from Paris who initially dismissed the men's superstitions about the White Devil. But his entries grew more and more unsettled as he began to document strange anomalies with the engineer's precise eye, descriptions of the mist moving against the wind, recordings of sudden, localized drops in temperature that defied explanation, sketches of peculiar, non-geometric patterns he claimed to have seen frost forming on his tent canvas the morning after. A sighting of the mist. The final entry, scrawled in a shaky, desperate hand the night before the catastrophe at the Berezina, made Pierre's heart stop. December 2nd. The men are whispering again. More disappearances last night, an entire picket line gone from the 4th Hussars. No sound, no tracks. Sergeant Dumont insists he saw figures within the fog this evening, tall and thin, like walking icicles. I scoffed, but then I saw it myself, just at dusk. It is not a weather pattern. It has a structure, a purpose. I attempted to take a bearing using my compass. The needle would not settle. It spun wildly, as if north itself meant nothing. Then I noticed it, a sound, or rather, the absence of one. A perfect sphere of silence, perhaps 10 meters across, centered on a lone birch tree. Outside the sphere, I could hear the wind. Inside, nothing. Not the creak of the tree, not the rustle of a single leaf. It was a hole in the world. I threw a rock into it. I saw it land in the snow. I heard nothing. No impact. It is real. It is studying us. It is learning how we make sound, how we break the silence. And I believe it is preparing to feed. We are not being hunted. We are being harvested. May God have mercy on our souls. Lefebvre's journal was not the rambling of a superstitious peasant or the hallucination of a starving man. It was the clinical, observed testimony of a trained mind, a corroboration of every terrifying detail Pierre had experienced and everything the old woodcutter had said. The white silence was not just a folktale. It was a real, observable phenomenon with measurable effects on the physical world, a predator that could create pockets of non-existence, that could defy the very laws of physics, and it had been watching them, learning from them, all along. Pierre clutched the journal to his chest as if it were a holy relic, the most valuable and terrifying object in all of Russia. He was not mad. He was not a liar. He had proof. The weight of this proof was immense, a burden that felt heavier than his hunger, his exhaustion, his fear. He now carried not only his own testimony but that of another, a man who had tried to quantify the unquantifiable and had paid for that knowledge with his life. The responsibility of it threatened to crush him. He could not let this truth die here in this frozen wasteland. He had to survive. He had to get this journal out. But to what end? Who would believe the words of a dead engineer and a half-mad conscript? The world would dismiss it as the ravings of men broken by a disastrous war. Yet he had to try. The memory of his comrades, not just their deaths but their absolute erasure, demanded it. Their story, the true story of their end, could not vanish into the Russian winter along with their bodies. With a new, grim purpose forged in the fire of this terrible evidence, Pierre buried Corporal Lefebvre as best he could under a cairn of stones, said a quick, silent prayer for the man's soul, and placed the precious journal inside his own tattered coat, against his heart. He turned his face once more towards the southwest, towards home, but he was no longer just Pierre Moreau, the boy from Languedoc trying to survive. He was now a courier, the sole bearer of a secret that could shatter the world's understanding of reality. And every step he took was a step away from the nightmare and towards an uncertain future where he would have to find the words, the courage, and the audience to speak the unspeakable. To tell the story of the vanishing army and the ancient, hungry silence that had consumed it, a story that was only just beginning. The journal, its leather cover cold against his skin but seeming to radiate a terrifying energy all its own, became the central axis around which Pierre's entire existence now revolved, a physical testament to the reality of the nightmare that had annihilated Marshal Ney's rearguard and stolen his comrades from the fabric of the world. Its pages filled with the meticulous, doomed observations of Corporal Lefebvre serving as both a sacred charge and an unbearable weight, a truth so colossal and horrifying that it threatened to eclipse his own identity, reducing the man named Pierre Moreau to a mere vessel, a delivery system for a message from the abyss. And with this grim purpose burning in his heart like a shard of ice, he pushed his broken body further than he thought possible. Driven by a desperate need to escape the borders of this accursed land where the silence held sway, to reach a place where the rules of physics and nature still applied, where sound was permanent and things that vanished left behind some echo, some evidence of there having been. His journey became a surreal and harrowing odyssey through the aftermath of apocalypse, the westward path a river of human wreckage and frozen despair, where the remnants of the Grande Armée, now less an army and more a scattered, dying herd of refugees, stumbled towards a salvation that felt increasingly mythical, and Pierre moved among them like a spectre, his eyes haunted by a knowledge they could not comprehend. Listening to their fragmented, shell-shocked accounts of the retreat, the battles, the cold, the Cossacks, but never, ever hearing a single mention of the white mist or the silent vanishings, as if the event at the Berezina had been edited from their collective memory, or perhaps only witnessed by those it had chosen to take, leaving Pierre and the dead Corporal Lefebvre as the only ones who knew the full, terrifying scope of the truth. He learned to keep his mouth shut, to bury the journal deep within his rags, to nod along with stories of heroic last stands and tragic accidents, all the while screaming inside at the monstrous incompleteness of their narratives, the gaping void where the real horror resided. He saw the way men looked at him, not with suspicion, but with a dull, animalistic emptiness. Their spirits so thoroughly crushed by conventional suffering that they had no capacity left for the supernatural, and he realized that his story, if told here, would not be believed but would instead mark him as finally, irreversibly insane, a man who had succumbed to the winter's madness. And so he wore his knowledge like a hidden wound, festering and poisonous, isolating him more completely than any physical distance ever could. The landscape itself seemed to conspire to reinforce his terrible secret. One evening, seeking shelter from a blistering wind in a small copse of trees, he came across a scene of perfect, unnatural peace, a circle of snow, perhaps 20 feet across, where the ground was utterly smooth and unmarked, not by wind, but as if it had been precisely planed by a divine carpenter, and in the center of this circle stood a single, skeletal birch tree, its branches sheathed in a layer of ice so clear and pure it looked like glass, and within this circle, there was no sound, not the howl of the wind that raged just beyond its invisible perimeter, not the crunch of his own boots as he approached its edge. It was a smaller, perfect replica of the silence he had witnessed, a quiet little pond of nothingness in the storm, and as he stared, terrified and mesmerized, he saw the frost on the branches of the tree begin to move. Not melting, but rearranging itself, forming those same non-geometric, impossibly intricate patterns Lefebvre had drawn in his journal, patterns that seemed to shift and writhe like living things, conveying a meaning that was just beyond the grasp of his human mind, a language of cold and silence, and he stumbled back, fleeing the sight as if it were plague-ridden. The image of that silently screaming tree burned into his retinas, a chilling confirmation that the phenomenon was not confined to a single, catastrophic event but was scattered throughout this land, leaving behind these terrible, silent scars. Days bled into one another, a blur of suffering and relentless motion, until he finally, miraculously, stumbled across the frozen Niemen River and collapsed on the Prussian side, not into safety, but into a different kind of chaos, that of the rear echelons, the supply depots, and the stunned, disbelieving administrators of the French Empire who were now faced with the impossible task of processing the ghost of an army that was trickling back from Russia, men who were less soldiers and more walking corpses, their numbers a fraction of the 500,000 that had crossed eastward just months before. He was picked up by a patrol, his French uniform, though in tatters, saving him from being shot as a deserter out of hand, and he was taken to a vast, overcrowded field hospital and barracks established in the city of Königsberg, a place that echoed with the moans of the dying and the hollow silence of the broken, a cacophony of human misery that was, perversely, the most beautiful music Pierre had ever heard. For it was real, it was messy, it was noisy, and it proved he was back in a world that still made sense. For a week, he did nothing but eat thin soup, sleep on a straw pallet, and slowly feel the warmth returning to his limbs, the constant, gnawing hunger in his belly receding to a dull ache, the simple act of being indoors and out of the wind a luxury so profound it brought him to tears on more than one occasion. But through it all, he never let the journal out of his possession, sleeping with it clutched in his hand. Its presence a constant reminder of the mission that lay ahead, the story that needed to be told. It was here, surrounded by the evidence of a historic military defeat, that he first began to understand the sheer scale of the official narrative being constructed. The generals and officials, desperate to salvage their own reputations and explain the inexplicable loss, were already crafting the story of the retreat, a tale of general winter, of Russian brutality, of supply lines stretched too thin. A story of a conventional, if catastrophic, defeat that placed the blame on logistics and the elements, a story that was neat, understandable, and most importantly, palatable to the citizens of the empire who would need a reason for the loss of their fathers, sons, and husbands. The Beloy Malchanai had no place in this story. It was an inconvenient, terrifying truth that would undermine the very foundations of rational thought and military doctrine, and Pierre, in his clearer moments, realized that walking into a command post and announcing that a supernatural force of silence had eaten Marshal Ney and his entire division would result in him being immediately thrown into a madhouse. The journal dismissed as the ravings of a feverish mind. His resolve, which had felt so ironclad out in the frozen wilderness, began to waver in the face of this organized, bureaucratic reality. Who was he, a lowly conscript from Languedoc, to challenge the official account of marshals and ministers? The weight of the journal felt heavier than ever, not a key to truth but an anchor destined to drag him down into obscurity and disgrace. This internal conflict was resolved in the most shocking way possible. During a routine roll call of survivors from his former regiment, a haggard sergeant major was reading names from a battered ledger, calling out into the crowd of broken men, and after a long pause he called out, "Moreau, Pierre!" And Pierre, acting on instinct, raised his hand and croaked, "Here." The sergeant major made a mark on his list and moved on. But later that evening, as Pierre sat alone with his bowl of soup, the same sergeant major approached him, his face a mask of confusion and suspicion. "Moreau?" the man grunted, looking down at his list. "Says here you were assigned to the 3rd Company, attached to Marshal Ney's personal guard detail for the Berezina crossing. That right?" Pierre nodded, his throat suddenly dry. The sergeant major shook his head, a look of profound unease on his face. "Well, that's a miracle then. Or a mistake. The entire roster for Ney's guard detail at the Berezina, they're all listed here. But the notation next to every single name, yours included, says Despera. Vanished. Presumed dead in the river crossing or captured. There's not a single survivor listed from that entire unit. Not one. The clerks, they think it's a paperwork error, a mix-up during the chaos, But I was there. I saw the list come in. It wasn't an error. It was like the entire unit never existed. He looked at Pierre, his eyes searching his face. So how did you survive, soldier? When no one else did? In that moment, Pierre understood the true nature of the White Silence's harvest. It didn't just take the men and their bodies. It took their history. It erased them from the rolls, from the memory of the bureaucracy. It snipped the thread of their existence with a terrifying completeness. He was an anomaly, a ghost who had slipped through the cracks, a mistake in the Silence's perfect consumption. The official story was already writing his comrades out of history, and he was the only one who could put them back in. He looked the sergeant major dead in the eye, and for the first time, he spoke a fragment of the truth. They didn't die in the river, Pierre said, his voice low but steady. They didn't get captured. They were taken. By something else. And I saw it happen. The sergeant major's face went pale, and he took a step back, crossing himself instinctively. He didn't ask for details. He simply nodded, a look of superstitious dread in his eyes that was far more convincing to Pierre than any logical argument could ever be. Then keep your story to yourself, son, the man whispered. For your own sake. The Empire doesn't need the truth. It needs heroes and martyrs. What you're selling, no one will buy it. He walked away, leaving Pierre more alone than ever, but now with a fiery determination reignited. The Empire might not want the truth, but he owed it to the vanished. He would find a way to be heard. He would get to Paris. He would find someone, anyone, who would look at Lefebvre's journal and see what he saw, who would believe the impossible. The journey home was no longer just about survival. It was a quest for an audience, a fight against the silence of forgetting, and Pierre, the sole survivor of a void, prepared to step back into the world of men, a living bomb waiting to explode its terrible truth. The world of men into which Pierre Moreau stepped, first in the teeming, chaotic refugee camps of Königsberg and then aboard a creaking, overcrowded supply wagon train slowly retracing the Grande Armée's triumphant advance back towards the heart of the French Empire, was a world utterly consumed by the mundane, all-encompassing tragedy of a military disaster of historic proportions, a reality so loud, so visceral, and so densely packed with human suffering that the subtle, terrifying truth he carried within the journal and within the scarred chambers of his own memory felt like a fragile, impossible secret, a single, perfectly preserved snowflake landing unnoticed in the middle of a raging battlefield, its intricate, deadly perfection doomed to be melted away by the sheer brute force of conventional narrative. Everywhere he looked, he saw the evidence of the story the Empire was building for itself. The maimed veterans huddled on street corners, their missing limbs and frostbitten faces serving as visceral, acceptable proof of the enemy's brutality and the winter's cruelty. The official bulletins nailed to town squares, praising the heroic sacrifice of the brave soldiers who had perished in the icy waters of the Berezina, or fallen to the Cossacks' lance, creating a pantheon of understandable, honorable deaths. The grieving families who clutched these brittle official notices, their tears falling for a loss they could at least comprehend, a death in battle, a drowning, a capture, tragedies within the realm of human experience. Pierre moved through this landscape of sanctioned grief like a ghost, listening to the stories traded by soldiers on the wagons, each tale a variation on the same themes of cold, hunger, and Russian steel, and he came to understand that the Beloy Molchanai had performed its grisly work with a diabolical efficiency. Not only by erasing the men but by providing a perfect vacuum into which a more palatable explanation could effortlessly flow, the complete absence of evidence, no bodies, no debris, no final stand, allowed the bureaucrats and generals to simply write a convenient ending, to plug the horrifying void with the familiar stuff of war, and the surviving soldiers, those who had not witnessed the event, had willingly, gratefully, adopted this explanation, their minds rejecting the incomprehensible in favor of the tragic but familiar. To speak his truth here would be not just futile, but a form of blasphemy. It would be to rob these grieving families of their last comfort, to tell a mother that her son had not died a hero's death in a river but had been unmade by a silent, alien force that left no grave to mourn, a concept so void of meaning it was arguably a fate worse than death. And so Pierre kept his silence, his jaw clenched tight. The leather-bound journal a lead weight against his heart, a ticking clock of truth in a world that had unanimously agreed to believe a lie. The journey west was a slow-motion emergence from a nightmare, the frozen wastes of Poland giving way to the familiar, orderly landscapes of Prussia and then the German states, where the signs of war were those of occupation and supply rather than annihilation, and finally, after weeks of jolting, miserable travel, the wagon train crossed the Rhine into France itself, and the sight of the familiar architecture, the sound of his native language spoken without a foreign accent, the smell of bread baking in proper brick ovens instead of campfire gruel, should have been a balm to his soul, but instead, it only heightened his feeling of alienation, for he was returning home as a stranger, a carrier of a pestilence of knowledge that had no place in this sane, orderly world. He was processed through a military depot in Metz, where he was given a cleanish uniform, a cursory medical examination that noted his malnourishment and mild frostbite but completely missed the profound psychological wound festering within him, and finally, a thin packet of papers that officially designated him as a survivor, granting him a furlough and a small sum of back pay. The bureaucratic machinery seamlessly absorbing him back into its gears, stamping his existence as valid and closing. The file on Pierre Moreau, conscript, with a neat notation that contradicted the Königsberg ledger, another small victory for the official story over the messy, terrifying truth. He took a public coach south, towards Languedoc, towards the vineyards and the sun and the waiting arms of Elise, each turn of the carriage wheels taking him further from the epicenter of the horror but doing nothing to distance him from the memory of it, the journal in his pack feeling less like a book and more like a repository containing the screaming souls of the vanished, their silent cries growing louder the closer he got to normalcy. He arrived in his village on a bright, crisp afternoon, the winter sun shining on the familiar limestone houses and the dormant vines stretching in neat rows over the hills, a scene of such profound peace and ordinariness that it felt like a dream, a beautiful, heartbreaking lie. And when he stood, trembling, before the door of the small cottage where Elise lived with her parents, and when she opened the door, her face first showing confusion at the gaunt, haunted-looking soldier on her step, then dawning recognition, then a joy so pure and explosive it brought her to tears as she flung herself into his arms, he held her tight, breathing in the scent of her hair, and felt the chasm between the man she was embracing, the boy she had promised to wait for, and the man he had become, a chasm as wide and as deep as the silence that had taken his comrades. The days that followed were a pantomime of normalcy. He ate the feasts her mother prepared, he drank the local wine with her father, he walked with Elise through the sleeping vineyards, and he told them the stories they could handle, the sighs of Moscow, the bitterness of the cold, the bravery of the men, carefully editing out the horror of the mist, the journal, the utter void of the Berezina, weaving for them the same tapestry of conventional suffering that everyone else was weaving, and they listened with tears in their eyes, holding his hands, thanking God for his safe return, completely unaware that the man they loved had left a vital part of himself, his truth, in Russia, and that a stranger had returned in his place. But the truth, like a buried seed, demanded to grow. It came out in his nightmares, where he would wake up screaming, drenched in a cold sweat, his ears straining for a sound that wouldn't come, and Elise would hold him, whispering comforting words about battle fatigue, unable to understand that his terror was not of things that had happened, but of a thing that was, a thing that defied language. It came out in his flinching at sudden silences, in his obsessive need to have a source of noise, a crackling fire, a ticking clock, a singing kettle, at all times, a constant reassurance that the world still produced sound. He knew he could not keep the truth buried forever. It was poisoning him, creating a wall of glass between him and everyone he loved, and so, one evening, sitting by the fire with Elise, he made a decision that would change everything. He took a deep breath, reached into his pack, and pulled out Corporal Lefebvre's journal. "There is a reason I survived when no one else in my unit did," he began, his voice low and shaking. "And it is not a reason you will find in any official report." And he told her everything. He started from the beginning, from the whispers in the camp, from his first sighting in the Moscow alley, from the old woodcutter's words, to the event at the Berezina, the utter silence, the lifting sensation, the return to reality to find everyone gone, the discovery of the journal, the sergeant major's words in Königsberg, the silent circle with the patterned tree. He held nothing back. Watching her face cycle through confusion, concern, fear, and finally, a dawning, horrified belief as he showed her Lefebvre's precise sketches and clinical notes, the evidence of a rational mind confronting the irrational. When he finished, the room was silent, save for the crackle of the fire. Elise stared at him, her eyes wide, her hand over her mouth. She did not call him mad. She did not dismiss him. Instead, she reached out and touched the journal, her fingers tracing the bloodstain on its cover, and she began to cry, not the tears of joy from his return, but tears of grief for the unimaginable horror he had witnessed and carried alone for so long. "My love," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "What a burden! What a terrible, terrible burden!" And in that moment of belief, of unconditional acceptance, Pierre felt the first stone in the wall around his heart crumble. He was not alone anymore. He had an ally. And with that alliance came a new resolve, a new purpose. The journey was not over. He could not stay in this peaceful village, pretending a normal life was possible. He had to go to Paris. He had to find someone in a position of power, someone with a mind open enough to see the truth, someone who could help him force the Empire to acknowledge what had really happened to the vanishing army. He had to become, not just a witness, but a prophet of a terrible new reality. And Elise, with tears still streaming down her face, looked at him with a fierce, determined love and said the words that would launch the next, even more dangerous phase of his quest. "Then we will go to Paris together. And we will make them listen." The quiet life was over. The fight for the truth had begun. The fight for the truth, a crusade that felt both nobler and more terrifying than any military campaign Pierre had endured, began not on the fields of battle but on the rough, jolting journey northwards in a public diligence coach, its cramped interior filled with the smells of unwashed bodies, cheap tobacco, and the pervasive scent of damp straw, a world away from the sun-drenched tranquility of Languedoc. A peace Pierre and Elise had willingly abandoned to step back into the fray of a world that was already trying desperately to forget the war and its losses, to paper over the gaping wounds of the nation with parades, propaganda, and a collective, determined amnesia that sought to move on from the disaster without ever truly examining its causes or its most bizarre, unresolved mysteries. Elise, her face pale but set with a resolve that constantly amazed Pierre, held his hand tightly during the long days of travel, her presence a steadying anchor in the storm of his anxieties, her belief in him and his story an unshakable fortress against the tide of doubt that threatened to overwhelm him every time he considered the sheer absurdity of their mission. Two provincial nobodies, one a traumatized former conscript and the other a vineyard-keeper's daughter, marching into the very heart of the Empire to challenge the official narrative crafted by marshals and ministers, armed with nothing but a blood-stained journal and a testimony that sounded like the ravings of a madman. Paris, when they finally arrived, was a shock to the system, a roaring, chaotic metropolis that was simultaneously in mourning and in a frantic, almost hysterical state of rebuilding and reinvention, its wide boulevards filled with a cacophony of sounds that assaulted Pierre's heightened senses. The clatter of carriages, the shouts of street vendors, the din of construction. A relentless noise that was both a constant reassurance and a source of exhaustion, a stark contrast to the predatory silence he knew lurked in the eastern forests. And everywhere they looked, they saw the ghost of the campaign. Veterans missing limbs begging on street corners, their hollow eyes following the fashionable crowds that hurried past them. Black crepe hanging from windows in the poorer quarters where the losses had been most keenly felt. And plaster busts of Napoleon, his expression still one of imperial confidence, staring out from shop windows. A symbol of a power that had been irrevocably cracked. They found a small, cheap room in a warren-like boarding house in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, a district teeming with artisans and a simmering, discontented energy that was a world away from the courtly splendor of the Tuileries. And here, surrounded by the hammering of carpenters and the gossip of washerwomen, they began their impossible task, formulating a plan that seemed more ludicrous with each passing day. To gain an audience with someone, anyone, in the upper echelons of power who would listen. Their first, naive attempts were met with uniform dismissal and ridicule. A clerk at the Ministry of War, after hearing Pierre's request to report a classified incident from the Russian campaign, looked at his tattered civilian clothes and lack of official documentation with utter contempt and had him physically escorted from the building by 2 board guards. A visit to the offices of a prominent newspaper ended with the editor, a cynical man with ink-stained fingers, laughing in their faces, and suggesting they try selling their fantastical story to a publisher of Gothic romances. Even a retired, wounded Captain Pierre managed to corner in a cafe, hoping for a sympathetic ear from a fellow soldier, listened with a patronizing smile before tapping his head and saying, "The winter was hard on all of us, son. You should go home and rest. Forget Russia." Each rejection was a hammer blow to Pierre's spirit, each condescending smile a fresh injection of despair, and he began to feel the walls closing in, the city's immense noise feeling less like a comfort and more like a smothering blanket intended to drown out his tiny, insignificant voice. It was Elise, with the practicality and resilience that constantly surprised him, who refused to let them give up. She was the one who suggested they stop targeting the official channels, which were clearly walled off to them, and instead look for others who might be predisposed to believe in the unexplained, the esoteric, the realms of knowledge that existed outside of imperial doctrine. "We need a scholar," she said one evening, their small room lit by a single guttering candle, the journal open between them on the rough wooden table. "Not a general. Someone who studies the world's mysteries. Someone who knows that not everything can be explained by a cannonball or a bayonet." This new strategy led them into the intellectual underbelly of Paris, a shadow city of salons, secret societies, and obscure libraries that thrived in the back rooms of bookshops and the apartments of eccentric collectors, a world fascinated by Egyptology, mesmerism, alchemy, and the occult, a community that lived for the very things the official world dismissed. It was in a dusty, cavernous bookshop specializing in works on Hermetic philosophy that their breakthrough finally came. The owner, an ancient, bespectacled man named Monsieur Lebeau, upon hearing Pierre's hesitant description of the patterns of Frost Lefebvre had documented, grew very still, his eyes widening behind his thick glasses. He disappeared into the back of his shop and returned with a massive, leather-bound folio, its pages crackling with age, written in a mix of Latin and archaic French. He laid it open on the counter, pointing a trembling finger at a woodcut print that made Pierre's blood run cold. It depicted a stylized, swirling vortex of ice and wind, and within it, barely visible, were tall, slender, non-human figures with features that were suggested rather than defined, and surrounding the image was text that described a phenomenon known as ventus silentiae, or the wind of silence, a legendary force said to inhabit the deepest, coldest reaches of the northern world, a presence that was neither angel nor demon but an elemental embodiment of void and stillness, that was drawn to the chaos of human conflict and which could, in times of great upheaval, manifest to cleanse areas of sound and life, leaving behind only perfect silence and occasionally strange, geometric patterns frozen into the landscape as a signature of its passing. "These legends are very old," Lebeau whispered, his voice full of awe and fear. "They come from the Sami people of the far north, from Siberian shamans, from tales older than any kingdom. Scholars have always dismissed them as primitive folklore, metaphors for the deadly winter. But your account, your engineer's drawings, they are the first modern, first-hand corroboration I have ever encountered. You must speak with Dr. Julien Favreau." He wrote a name and address on a slip of paper. "He is a member of the Institut de France, a geologist and meteorologist by trade, but his private passion is the study of what he calls anomalous atmospheric phenomena. He is the only man in Paris who might look at your evidence and not call for the asylum guards." Finding Dr. Favreau was not easy. He was a reclusive, intensely private man who rarely made public appearances, but after days of patiently waiting and sending carefully worded notes, they were finally granted an audience at his private residence, a large, somewhat gloomy house on the left bank that was more library than home, its shelves groaning under the weight of scientific instruments, rock samples, and books in a dozen languages. Favreau himself was a tall, gaunt man in his 60s, with a piercing, intelligent gaze that missed nothing, and he listened to Pierre's story in complete silence, not interrupting, his long fingers steepled under his chin, his expression unreadable. When Pierre finished and placed Corporal Lefebvre's journal on the desk before him, Favreau spent nearly an hour examining it, his eyes devouring every word, every sketch, every notation about compass anomalies and temperature drops, his face a mask of intense concentration. When he finally looked up, his eyes were alight with a fierce, blazing curiosity, the look of a man who has spent his life searching for a key and has just been handed it. "This is extraordinary," he breathed, his voice full of a reverence that was entirely new to Pierre. "This is not madness, Monsieur Moreau. This is observation. Flawed, terrified, but brilliant observation. Lefebvre was a hero of science, though he would never know it." He rose and paced his study, his mind racing. The patterns, the localized silence, the EM disturbances, it all fits a hypothesis I have been developing for years, that there are certain rare, and perhaps sentient, meteorological electrical phenomena that are not understood by modern science. A form of self-organizing plasma, perhaps, shaped by geomagnetic forces, that exists at extreme low temperatures, a storm of stillness. What you call the white silence. He turned to them, his expression grave. "But you must understand the danger you are in. The empire is fragile. Napoleon's power is shaken. The last thing anyone in authority wants is a mystery that undermines the very rational, Newtonian worldview upon which his power, and modern Europe, is built. Your truth is a threat. If you continue down this path, you will not just be dismissed. You will be silenced. The human way." He saw the determination in their eyes and nodded slowly. "Very well. Then we must work in the shadows. You will stay here as my guests. We have much to do. We must corroborate your story, find other witnesses you may have missed, and build a case so undeniable that it cannot be ignored. The world must know what happened to those men. Not for glory, but for truth." And so, Pierre and Elise found themselves with a powerful, brilliant, and unorthodox ally, moving from the noisy, dismissive streets of Paris into the quiet, book-lined sanctuary of Dr. Favreau's home, their quest evolving from a desperate plea for belief into a clandestine scientific investigation, a gathering of evidence against an enemy that was not a nation, but a fundamental force of nature. An enemy that had already won its first battle by being erased from history, and now the fight to reclaim that history, to give the vanished a voice, was about to begin in earnest, deep within the heart of a city that was already dreaming of forgetting. The fight to reclaim history, to drag the terrifying truth of the Beloy Malchini out of the shadows of Siberian folklore and into the stark, rational light of a Parisian study, began not with a dramatic proclamation but with a meticulous, painstaking work of a scientific inquest, a process that saw Pierre, Elise, and Dr. Favreau transformed into detectives of the impossible, their world shrinking to the confines of the doctor's dusty, book-filled mansion on the Rue des Saints-Pères, a sanctuary that felt both like a fortress protecting them from the dismissive world outside and a laboratory for dissecting a nightmare. Favreau, with the fervent energy of a man who has dedicated his life to the fringes of knowledge only to have its most profound validation land on his desk, became the architect of their investigation, immediately recognizing that Pierre's testimony and Lefebvre's journal, while earth-shattering to them, were merely anecdotal in the eyes of the wider scientific community, a community he knew was deeply skeptical, conservative, and inextricably linked to the political establishment that needed the Russian disaster to remain a simple, tragic story of logistical failure and harsh weather. "We need more than a story," Favreau declared, his fingers tracing the intricate, non-Euclidean patterns Lefebvre had sketched in the journal's margins. "We need a pattern. We need physics. We need to prove that what you witnessed operates not outside the laws of nature, but according to laws we have not yet discovered." He immediately set to work cross-referencing the journal's entries with his own vast archives of meteorological data, searching for any anomalies in barometric pressure, geomagnetic activity, or temperature records in western Russia during the period of the retreat, looking for a tangible, measurable fingerprint of the phenomenon, a scientific ghost in the machine of the known world. Simultaneously, he deployed his considerable network of academic correspondence across Europe, sending out discreet, carefully worded letters to colleagues in Prussia, Austria, and even Russia itself, inquiring about any local legends or recent, unexplained events involving strange fogs, silent zones, or mass disappearances in the region of the Berezina. Framing it as a piece of obscure folkloric research to avoid raising alarm, a fishing expedition in the deep waters of the unexplained. Pierre's role in this new phase was both cathartic and agonizing. Under Favreau's gentle but persistent questioning, he was forced to relive every second of his experience at the Berezina over and over again, drilling down into sensory details he had tried to suppress. the exact quality of the cold. Not a dry cold, nor a wet cold, but a sucking cold, as if it drew the heat from within you. The precise way sound vanished. It was not like going deaf, it was as if sound itself had been invented, the specific appearance of the figures in the mist. Tall, too tall, and they seemed to be made of the same substance as the mist, but structured, like ice crystals given form. These sessions were exhausting, often leaving Pierre trembling and drenched in a cold sweat. But Elise was always there, her hand in his, her quiet strength a bulwark against the trauma, and slowly, under Favreau's expert guidance, Pierre's fragmented, terror-filled memories began to coalesce into a more coherent, detailed account, providing raw data for the doctor's theories. Favreau, in turn, began to develop a fascinating, if horrifying, hypothesis. He postulated that the Beloy Malchini was not a supernatural entity, but a previously unclassified extreme-state plasma, a self-organizing structure of ionized air and microscopic ice crystals that existed at the boundary of matter and energy. Sustained by the unique geomagnetic conditions of the northern latitudes and empowered by the massive, chaotic energy output of the battlefield, the heat of cannon fire, the electrical charge of thousands of moving bodies, the emotional turmoil, which it fed upon by enacting a localized, perfect entropic reversal, canceling out kinetic energy, absorbing sound waves, and effectively freezing a pocket of reality into a state of absolute zero and absolute silence, a process that would appear to witnesses as erasure of matter and energy. It is a natural predator, Favreau explained, his eyes alight with a terrifying awe. But not of flesh. It is a predator of chaos. It seeks out centers of immense noise and conflict, and restores them to silence and order, its most perfect state. The battlefield, for this thing, was not a tragedy, it was a banquet. This scientific framework, while cold and clinical, gave Pierre a strange sense of solace. It meant the thing that took his comrades was not a demon or a ghost, but a force of nature, as real as a lightning bolt or a tornado, albeit infinitely more rare and complex, a concept that, while still terrifying, was somehow easier for his battered mind to process than an outright supernatural evil. Their first major breakthrough came not from Favreau's scientific instruments, but from his network of correspondence. A letter arrived from a German naturalist stationed in Königsberg, who reported hearing a bizarre story from a Lithuanian cartographer, a story about a cursed grove near the Berezina, a circular patch of forest where no birds sang, no animals ventured, and where the trees were covered in a layer of glass-like ice that never melted, even in high summer, and were etched with devil's patterns that matched, almost exactly, the sketches in Lefebvre's journal. This was it, physical evidence. A permanent scar left by the phenomenon. The trio was electrified. They had to go there. They had to see it, document it, take samples. But going back to Russia, for Pierre, was akin to walking back into the belly of the beast. The very thought sent him into a days-long panic, nightmares of the silence returning with a vengeance, and it was Elise who, once again, provided the steady, unwavering resolve. "We have to," she said softly, but with iron in her voice. "For Lefebvre. For Ney. For all of them. We have to bring back proof that cannot be ignored." Favreau, ever the strategist, began planning a clandestine expedition, not as French citizens, but under the guise of a Swiss botanical survey, using his academic credentials to secure passes and leveraging his contacts to arrange guides who would take them to the coordinates provided by the Lithuanian cartographer. The plan was dangerous in the extreme. Napoleon's empire was crumbling, the roads were lawless, and Russia was a hostile enemy nation, but the potential reward, the chance to secure irrefutable proof, made the risk seem necessary. As Favreau made the logistical arrangements, Pierre found himself grappling with a profound internal conflict. The journey back east felt like a regression, a voluntary return to the trauma he had barely survived, a risk not only of his life but of his fragile, hard-won sanity, and the thought of exposing Elise to the horrors he had witnessed filled him with a dread deeper than any fear for his own safety. One night, overwhelmed by the looming prospect, he confessed his fears to her, begging her to stay in Paris, to be safe, but she refused, her eyes blazing with a love that was fierce and protective. "I did not come this far to wait safely behind," she said. "Your fight is my fight. Your silence is my silence. Where you go, I go. We face this thing together, or not at all. Her words, instead of frightening him, filled him with a renewed strength. He was not the scared conscript fleeing the silence anymore. He was a man with a purpose, armed with knowledge, supported by love, and guided by one of the brightest minds in Europe. He was going back to the heart of the nightmare not as a victim, but as an investigator, a hunter of truth. The Parisian spring was beginning to bloom outside the windows of Favreau's study, but inside, the three of them were preparing for a return to winter, to silence, and to the unknown. The quiet, scholarly pursuit was over. The field expedition was about to begin. The hunt for the physical evidence of the vanishing army was on, and they would venture into the cursed groves of Russia to find it, to look the silence in the face once more, and this time, they would not run. The hunt for physical evidence, a quest that propelled them from the theoretical safety of a Parisian library directly back into the geopolitical and supernatural maelstrom from which Pierre had only recently escaped, was a logistical and psychological ordeal that began the moment they crossed the Rhine into the contested, war-ravaged territories of Central Europe. Their journey eastward a grim mirror image of his previous retreat, each mile retracing the path of the Grande Armée's destruction. Now serving as a constant, grim reminder of the stakes of their mission and the pervasive, looming shadow of the enemy they sought to document. Traveling under the meticulously forged identities of a Swiss botanist, Favreau, his assistant, Pierre, and his wife, Elise, a cover story that felt flimsy against the hardened, suspicious gazes of the Prussian border guards and the freelance bandits who preyed on the roads, they moved in a state of heightened, nerve-shredding alertness. Their carriage loaded not with weapons but with scientific equipment that seemed absurdly out of place in the landscape of deprivation, brass-barreled air samplers, delicate electrometers to measure atmospheric charge, specially treated glass plates for capturing frost impressions, and a cumbersome camera obscura that Favreau hoped could somehow photograph the intangible, all of it carefully packed amidst their personal effects and jars of preserving alcohol meant for plant specimens, a bizarre arsenal for a war against silence. For Pierre, every familiar landmark, a particular bend in a river, the silhouette of a ruined church, a certain configuration of forest, was a trigger, unleashing a flood of traumatic memories that threatened to overwhelm his carefully constructed composure, the smell of the pine trees and the cold, damp earth acting as a Proustian Madeline that transported him not to a place of comfort but directly back to the hunger, the fear, and the echoing silence of the retreat, and it was only Elise. Constant, grounding presence, her hand finding his in the jolting darkness of the carriage, her voice pulling him back from the brink of panic attacks with quiet reminders of their purpose, that kept him functional, her love the one stable point in a universe that seemed increasingly tilted towards madness. Favreau, for his part, was a whirlwind of academic excitement and paternal concern, his eyes constantly scanning the environment, taking barometric readings, collecting soil samples, and jotting down observations in a leather-bound notebook, treating the entire journey as an extended field study. Yet his sharp eyes also missed nothing of Pierre's struggle, or the very real physical dangers around them. His mind constantly calculating risks and contingencies, the weight of responsibility for these two young people he had dragged into his obsession settling heavily upon his shoulders. Their first major obstacle was the city of Königsberg, now a swollen, paranoid garrison town teeming with the remnants of various armies and rife with spies and informers, where their Swiss cover story was subjected to intense, bureaucratic scrutiny by officials who were deeply uneasy about anyone, especially foreign academics, showing an interest in the Eastern territories so soon after the war. It was here that Favreau's network proved its worth, a whispered introduction to a certain university professor with dual loyalties secured them the necessary travel papers and, more importantly, the services of their guide, a man named Christophe, a dour, hulking Lithuanian trapper with a deeply scarred face and a profound, simmering hatred for all things French, who agreed to take them to the cursed grove near the Berezina, not for money, but because Favreau's academic letter had mentioned devil's patterns. And Christophe had a personal, bitter score to settle with the devil, a story he refused to share but which hung around him like a shroud. With Christophe leading the way in a rugged, horse-drawn sled, they left the last vestiges of the modern world behind, plunging into the deep, snow-drifted wilderness of what had once been the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, a vast, white expanse of frozen marshes and ancient, brooding forests that felt timeless and utterly indifferent to human affairs. A land where the rules of Parisian science felt increasingly abstract and the old rules of folklore felt disconcertingly immediate. Christophe, a man of few words, communicated mostly through grunts and gestures, but his knowledge of the land was absolute, his instincts uncanny, and he possessed a deep, ingrained wariness that kept them away from patrols of Cossack horsemen and the desperate, starving bands of deserters who still haunted the woods. But it was his behavior as they drew closer to the Berezina that became most telling. He grew increasingly silent, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line not for human threats, but for something else, his hand never far from the long, wicked knife at his belt, and he began to observe old protective rituals, sprinkling salt over his shoulder at crossroads and muttering prayers under his breath in a language that sounded ancient and guttural. The air itself began to change as they neared the coordinates. The normal sounds of the forest, the chattering of squirrels, the call of birds, the wind in the pines, began to fade, not abruptly, but gradually, as if someone were slowly turning down a vast, cosmic volume knob, creating a pervasive, creeping quiet that was, in its own way, more terrifying than the sudden silence Pierre had experienced before, because it felt deliberate, a slow-motion approach rather than a sudden attack. Pierre's anxiety, which had been a constant, low hum, now escalated into a piercing scream of primal recognition. Every fiber of his being told him to turn back, to flee, that they were walking into the lion's den. And the journal in his pack felt less like a book and more like a homing beacon, calling out to the very thing it described. Elise, though pale and frightened, remained steadfast, her scientific curiosity now ignited, her eyes taking in every detail with a clarity that shamed Pierre's own terror, while Favreau was practically vibrating with suppressed excitement, his instruments already deployed, noting the bizarre readings on his electrometer with audible gasps of disbelief. The charge, it's not spiking, it's inverting, it's reading a negative energy field, this is impossible, he whispered, his voice full of a kind of reverent horror. And then they found it. The cursed grove. It was exactly as the Lithuanian cartographer had described, a perfect circle of immense, ancient pine trees, perhaps 100 yards across, standing in the midst of the normal forest like an island of wrongness. The ground within the circle was devoid of snow, not melted, but absent, revealing black, frozen earth that was smooth and featureless, as if polished. And the trees were the stuff of nightmares. They were sheathed in a thick, perfectly clear layer of ice that seemed to have grown from the inside out, magnifying and distorting the bark beneath, and etched into this glassy surface were the patterns. They were not frost. They were deep, precise grooves carved into the ice itself, swirling, non-repeating, infinitely complex geometries that seemed to shift and dance in the corner of the eye, patterns that matched Lefebvre's sketches with an eerie, impossible precision, patterns that hurt to look at for too long, causing a disorienting sense of vertigo and a faint, high-pitched ringing in the ears. The silence here was absolute. Profound. It was a physical pressure on the eardrums. Christophe refused to cross the threshold, remaining outside the circle, making warding signs with his hands, his face a mask of superstitious terror. Favreau, however, stepped across the invisible boundary with the awe of a man entering a cathedral, his boots making no sound on the strange, hard ground. Pierre and Elise followed, holding hands, their breath catching in their throats. The air within the circle was deathly still and cold, a cold that felt old and intelligent. Favreau immediately began to work, setting up his camera obscura with trembling hands, preparing glass plates, taking scrapings of the ice from the trees, his movements hushed and reverent. It was Elise who noticed it first. She pointed a trembling finger at the base of the largest tree in the center of the grove. There, half embedded in the strange, glassy earth, was not a rock or a root, but a button. A brass button, stamped with the imperial eagle of France. Then they saw another. And another. A scrap of blue wool from a greatcoat. A rusted bayonet. A single, frozen leather boot. The grove was not just a scar, it was a reliquary. It was a museum of the vanished. The silence had not completely erased them, it had digested them, and here, in its lair, it had excreted the indigestible fragments, the tiny, metallic and composite pieces of the army it had consumed, leaving them scattered about like grisly trophies. Pierre fell to his knees, his hands brushing against the frozen boot, a sob wrenching itself from his throat, the final, Horrific confirmation of the truth, both devastating and vindicating. They had found it. They had proof. But as Pierre looked up from the ground, his eyes blurry with tears, he saw something that made his blood freeze solid. On the far side of the grove, standing just within the tree line, watching them, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly thin, and seemed to be composed of the same clear, refractive ice that sheathed the trees. It had no discernible face, only a smooth, oval head, and it stood perfectly still, one long, crystalline arm slightly raised, as if in curiosity, or perhaps in warning. It was one of the figures from the mist. It was here. And it was watching them. The hunt was over. They had found their evidence. And the evidence had found them. The evidence, in the form of a silent, crystalline sentinel standing at the edge of the cursed grove, had not only found them but had fundamentally recalibrated the nature of their entire expedition, transforming it from a daring mission of scientific discovery into a primal standoff between human consciousness and an utterly alien intelligence. A moment frozen in time where the very air seemed to solidify around them, thick with a tension that was both terrifying and strangely reverent, as if they were trespassers in a cathedral of a god they could not comprehend. The figure did not move, did not advance. It simply observed, its smooth, featureless head tilted at an angle that suggested a deep, analytical curiosity, its body composed of the same impossibly clear, refractive ice that encased the trees, making it shimmer and blend with the distorted landscape behind it, a living sculpture of frozen silence that radiated an aura of profound, ancient cold that seemed to leach the warmth from their souls just by its proximity. Pierre felt his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic, terrified drumbeat that was the only sound in the absolute void of the grove, his mind screaming at him to run, to flee, to abandon the equipment and the proof and simply survive. But his body was locked in place, paralyzed by a fear so absolute it felt like a physical force, his eyes locked on the impossible entity, seeing in its silent still formed the culmination of every nightmare that had haunted him since the Berezina. Elise, beside him, had let out a small, choked gasp, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror that was tempered by a fierce, blazing wonder, the scientist in her overriding the instinct for self-preservation, her mind desperately trying to catalog, to understand, to fit this living phenomenon into any known framework of biology or physics and failing utterly, leaving her with a staggering, humbling realization that they were in the presence of something truly new, something beyond human classification. Dr. Favreau, who had been crouched by his camera obscura, slowly, carefully, rose to his feet, his movements deliberate and non-threatening, his face pale but alight with an expression of such intense, rapturous awe that it bordered on religious ecstasy. He made no move to grab a weapon, but instead slowly raised his empty hands in a gesture that could have been surrender, or greeting, or simply a human's instinctual response to the sublime, his eyes drinking in every detail of the creature, memorizing its form, its posture, its eerie, silent presence. Incroyable! He breathed, the word forming a puff of vapor in the frigid air, a tiny, transient violation of the perfect silence that seemed to hang in the space between them and the entity, a sound that felt blasphemously loud. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The creature remained as still as a statue, a part of the grove itself. Then, with a motion that was so smooth and fluid it seemed to defy the laws of inertia, it raised its other arm, the long, crystalline fingers extending towards them, not in a threatening gesture, but almost like an artist indicating a subject, and as it did so, the patterns etched into the ice of the trees around them began to glow with a faint, internal, phosphorescent blue light, the complex geometries swirling and shifting, flowing like liquid electricity across the frozen bark, creating a mesmerizing, hypnotic display that seemed to communicate a meaning just beyond the edge of comprehension, a language of light and frozen mathematics. Pierre felt a strange pressure in his mind, not a voice, not words, but a presence, a cold, vast intelligence gently probing at the edges of his consciousness, sifting through his memories, and he was suddenly assaulted by a flood of sensory impressions from the retreat. The taste of fear, the ache of hunger, the deafening roar of cannon fire, all of it being observed, analyzed, and filed away by the serene, detached mind of the creature, which seemed fascinated by the chaos and noise of human experience. It was not hostile, it was Curious. It was studying them. Just as Lefebvre had predicted. The pressure shifted to Elise, and he saw her shudder, her eyes closing as the entity sampled her memories of Languedoc, of sunlight and vineyards and love, emotions that seemed to cause the glowing patterns on the trees to flutter and shift into softer, more harmonious shapes. Finally, the presence settled on Favreau, and the doctor actually smiled, a tear tracing a path through the stubble on his cheek as he willingly opened his mind, offering up his lifetime of knowledge, his theories of plasma and electromagnetism, his quest for understanding, and the creature seemed to appreciate it, the patterns accelerating into a complex, beautiful dance of light that reflected the intricate equations and hypotheses Favreau had spent his life developing. This silent, psychic communion lasted for perhaps a minute, but it felt like an eternity, a sharing of essences that was as intimate as it was terrifying. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure vanished. The glowing patterns on the trees faded back to their dormant state. The creature lowered its arm. And then it did something utterly unexpected. It took a single, silent step backwards, deeper into the tree line. Then another. It was not advancing. It was retreating. It was allowing them to leave. It had satisfied its curiosity and found them, if not understandable, then at least interesting. Not a threat. Not food. But specimens worthy of observation and release. The message was clear. The grove was not a lair. It was a laboratory. And they had been granted the rare privilege of leaving it. The spell broken, Christophe, who had been watching from the edge of the circle with a face strained of all blood, finally found his voice, a hoarse, terrified whisper that cracked the silence like a gunshot. Dveja, he breathed, the Lithuanian word for a spirit or entity. It knows we are here. It lets us live. We must go. Now. The urgency in his voice galvanized them into action. Favreau, moving with a speed that belied his age, carefully secured the exposed glass plate in his camera, grabbed the samples of ice he had scraped from the trees, and shoved them into his pack. Pierre, his hands trembling, scooped up a handful of the relics from the ground, the buttons, the scrap of wool, the bayonet, stuffing them into his pocket, tangible proof of the army's fate. Elise helped him to his feet, her own legs unsteady. They did not run. They backed away slowly, respectfully, never taking their eyes off the spot where the creature had vanished, until they had crossed back over the invisible boundary of the grove and into the world of sound, where the wind suddenly seemed deafeningly loud and their own ragged breaths sounded like bellows. Christophe did not wait for discussion. He turned and began striding quickly back the way they had come, his pace just short of a run, expecting them to follow. The journey back to their base camp was a silent, frantic blur, each of them lost in the enormity of what they had experienced, the encounter playing over and over in their minds, a memory that felt both dreamlike and hyperreal. It was only when they were safely within the relative security of their tents, a small fire crackling between them, that they finally spoke, their voices hushed and awestruck. Favreau was the first to break the silence, his voice trembling with excitement. "It's not a predator, not in the way we thought. It's a scientist, a natural philosopher. It studies chaos. It archives it. Those patterns, they are its notes. Its language. It was recording us." Pierre, however, was grappling with a darker implication. "It studied my memories of the battle, of the noise and the fear. It was fascinated by it. That's what draws them. That's the feast. The chaos. The emotion. The sound." Elise, ever the pragmatist, brought them back to earth. "It let us go. It gave us a warning, but it also gave us proof. We have the photographs, the samples, the relics. We have everything we need." But as they looked at each other in the flickering firelight, they all knew the same, terrifying truth. They had the proof, but the proof was now alive. They had not just documented a phenomenon, they had made contact with an intelligence. And they had no idea if that intelligence would now take an ongoing interest in them, if their journey back to Paris would be observed, or if they had just become part of its permanent, frozen archive. The hunt for evidence was over. They had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. But they had also unleashed a new, more complex and terrifying phase of their quest, the return home with a truth that was now sentient, and the dreadful uncertainty of what that truth would do once it was let loose upon the world. They had looked into the silence, and the silence had looked back, and now they had to carry its gaze with them all the way to Paris. The gaze of the silence, an intangible yet crushing weight of alien observation that they now carried with them out of the cursed grove and onto the long, treacherous road back to the west, transformed their journey from a mere physical retreat into a profound psychological and spiritual ordeal. Every rustle of a leaf, every creak of a branch, every unnatural stillness in the air becoming a potential sign that they were being watched, followed, studied by the serene and terrifying intelligence they had encountered, turning the vast, snowy landscape into a panopticon where they were both the prisoners and the exhibits, their every move, their every whispered conversation, their every fearful glance feeling like it was being recorded in some vast, frozen ledger of a consciousness they could not hope to understand. Christophe, their guide, was of no comfort. His superstitious dread had curdled into a sullen, simmering terror that made him push the pace to a brutal, exhausting degree, his eyes constantly darting into the shadows of the endless birch forests, his hand never leaving the haft of his knife, and he refused to speak of what they had seen, responding to any question with a grunt or a muttered prayer in his native tongue. His only goal to put as much distance as possible between his soul and the Dvaja's domain, a goal everyone shared but which felt increasingly futile, as if the entity's awareness was not bound by geography but by connection, and they had forged a connection by simply looking upon it, and being looked upon in return. Inside the jolting confines of the sled, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken anxiety and the electric aftermath of revelation. Dr. Favreau spent most of the journey in a state of feverish activity, meticulously cataloging the physical evidence they had gathered. The ice samples kept frozen in insulated jars, the relics of the vanished soldiers wrapped in soft cloth, the precious glass photographic plates sealed in light-tight boxes. But his hands trembled as he worked, and his usual academic chatter was replaced by a deep, contemplative silence, his mind clearly wrestling with the philosophical earthquake of having his life's work validated in a way that was far more profound and terrifying than he had ever imagined, the concept of a sentient atmospheric phenomenon forcing him to rethink the very definitions of life, intelligence, and the boundaries of the natural world. Pierre, sitting beside Elise, felt the encounter replaying in his mind on a continuous, haunting loop, but the memory was changing. The initial, paralyzing terror was slowly being overlaid with the eerie, calm curiosity the entity had projected, the feeling of that vast, cold mind sifting through his memories of love and fear and war, and he was left with a disorienting sense of violation mixed with a strange, grudging awe. He had been in the presence of something ancient, powerful, and utterly indifferent to human concepts of good and evil, a force of nature that viewed the horrific battle of the Berezina as nothing more than an interesting data point, a complex symphony of chaos to be archived and silenced, and this perspective, while horrifying, somehow lessened the personal trauma of his experience, placing it within a larger, colder, and infinitely more strange cosmic context. Elise, ever the anchor, was the one who began to articulate the practical, terrifying implications that the others were too overwhelmed to voice. "It let us go," she said quietly one evening as they huddled around a meager fire, their breath pluming in the frigid air, her words drawing Favreau and Pierre's immediate, rapt attention. "But why? It studied us. It learned from us. It knows we possess knowledge of it. It knows we intend to share that knowledge. If its purpose is to silence chaos, to archive it and remove it, then what we are doing, returning to the noisy, chaotic world of men with this story, is the exact opposite of what it desires. We are not just carrying proof, we are carrying a catalyst for unimaginable noise. So why did it allow us to leave? Unless," she trailed off, her face pale in the firelight, "unless it wants us to bring the story back. Unless our act of telling it is part of the experiment. We are not just observers. We are agents. We are delivering the stimulus for its next feeding." Her hypothesis landed like a bombshell in the quiet camp. The idea that they were not escapees but pawns, that their entire mission to reveal the truth was itself a variable in the entity's incomprehensible experiment, was a thought so monstrous it threatened to unravel their resolve completely. Were they heroes fighting for truth, or were they unwitting heralds beckoning the very thing they feared into the heart of their own civilization? This terrifying new doubt cast a pall over every step of the remaining journey, making their hard-won evidence feel less like a triumph and more like a cursed object, a Pandora's box they were now obligated to open. The final leg of their return to Königsberg was a tense, paranoid affair. They expected at any moment to be intercepted by Russian patrols, their precious evidence confiscated and themselves thrown into some dank prison, but they encountered only the usual hardships of the road, the cold, the poor rations, the exhaustion, and they slipped back into the bustling, paranoid city like ghosts. Their extraordinary secret hidden amidst the mundane despair of a defeated region. In Königsberg, they faced their first real test of the evidence's power. Favreau, using his contacts, managed to secure a private meeting with a high-ranking, disaffected Prussian intelligence officer who had his own reasons for wanting to embarrass the French Empire. A man who listened to their story with a cynical smirk until Favreau laid out the relics on his desk, the French army buttons, the scrap of a greatcoat, the bayonet, and then showed him one of the glass plate photographs, developed in a makeshift darkroom in their inn. The image was hazy, ethereal, but unmistakable. It showed the cursed grove, the trees sheathed in their impossible, patterned ice, and there, in the background, barely visible but undeniably present, was the tall, slender, crystalline figure, its form shimmering with an otherworldly light. The Prussian officer's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of stunned, superstitious dread. He did not believe their story, not truly, but he believed the evidence was strange enough to be useful. He provided them with new travel papers, expediting their passage west, not out of belief, but out of a calculated desire to unleash a psychological weapon into the heart of France. Their journey back to Paris was a fever dream of anxiety and anticipation. The world outside their carriage was moving on, talking of Napoleon's shaky hold on power, of new coalitions forming against him, of the mundane politics of a world completely unaware of the paradigm-shattering truth that was traveling towards its capital in a few sealed boxes. For Pierre, the return to the noisy, vibrant streets of Paris was even more disorienting than the first time. He felt like a ghost walking among the living, seeing the carefree laughter in the cafes, the animated political arguments on the boulevards, the sheer, glorious, chaotic noise of a great city, and all he could think of was Elise's warning, that this was the feast, this was the chaos that would draw the silence, and that they were the ones who were about to ring the dinner bell. They returned to Favreau's mansion on the Rue de Saints-Pères, but it no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a command bunker on the eve of a battle against an enemy no one else could see. The evidence was secured in Favreau's vault, but the knowledge was now loose among them, and it demanded action. The question was no longer if they would reveal the truth, but how. A public announcement would see them ridiculed and institutionalized. A private report to the government would see it buried. They needed a platform, credibility, and irrefutable demonstration. Favreau, his eyes burning with a new, almost fanatical light, knew what they had to do. The Institut de France, he declared. We will demand a closed session. We will show them the evidence. The photographs, the relics, the samples. We will present it not as a ghost story, but as a scientific discovery. A new branch of physics. A new form of life. We will make them see. The plan was audacious, borderline suicidal. It meant staking their reputations, their freedom, and perhaps their very lives on the ability to convince the most skeptical, conservative minds in Europe of something that sounded like madness. But they had come too far to turn back. They had the evidence. They had the testimony. And they had the terrifying, unshakable certainty that they were being allowed to do it, that the silence itself was watching, waiting to see what noise they would make. Pierre looked at Elise, and then at Favreau, and he nodded, his fear now channeled into a grim, determined resolve. They would take their truth to the very heart of the establishment. They would force the world to look into the silence. And they would pray that when it looked back, it would not decide to silence them all. The final stage of their mission was about to begin. The quiet was over. The noise was coming. The noise, a carefully orchestrated, meticulously planned cacophony of scientific revelation that they were about to unleash within the hallowed, silent halls of the Institut de France, represented the culmination of every mile traveled, every fear confronted, every shred of evidence gathered at immense personal cost. A deliberate act of throwing a rock into the placid pond of European rationalism and watching with bated breath to see not just the ripples, but what monstrous, unseen thing might be stirred from the depths in response. A gamble with stakes that were nothing less than the world's understanding of reality itself. The week of preparation within the cloistered confines of Favreau's mansion was a period of intense, frenetic activity that felt like assembling a weapon of mass enlightenment. Favreau, operating on a mix of manic energy and sleep-deprived genius, locked himself in his laboratory with the eye samples, subjecting them to every test his formidable array of equipment could devise. Microscopic examination that revealed a crystalline structure unlike any known natural ice, electrical stimulation that caused the embedded patterns to fluoresce with that same eerie blue light, and chemical assays that showed traces of metallic alloys and organic compounds that matched the composition of French army buttons and woolen greatcoats, providing a forensic link between the phenomenon and the vanished men that was scientifically irrefutable. Meanwhile, Pierre and Elise worked on the human element of their presentation, painstakingly preparing a narrative that wove Pierre's raw, emotional testimony together with the cold, clinical observations from Lefebvre's journal, creating a dual-perspective account that appealed to both the heart and the mind, a story of soldiers and scientists, of bayonets and barometers, that gave the unimaginable tragedy a human face and a scientific framework, all while the developed photographic plates, showing the grove and its silent, crystalline sentinel, sat in their protective cases like sleeping dragons waiting to be awakened, the most dangerous and unbelievable piece of evidence they possessed. The challenge of even gaining an audience was formidable. The Institut de France was a fortress of intellectual tradition, its members, renowned astronomers, physicists, chemists, and mathematicians, were not easily swayed by tales of supernatural horror, and Favreau, for all his respected eccentricity, was risking his entire reputation by presenting such a heretical thesis. So his approach had to be one of subtle subversion. He did not request a session on monsters in the snow, but instead sent a formally worded, tantalizingly vague missive to the key members of the physics and geography sections, hinting at a profound discovery in the fields of atmospheric electromagnetism and exotic matter formation observed during the recent Eastern campaigns, with significant implications for our understanding of energy and entropy. A phrasing designed to prick their scientific curiosity without triggering their dismissive prejudices. The ruse worked. A closed session was granted, not in the grand amphitheater, but in a smaller, wood-paneled conference room within the Institute's labyrinthine complex, a setting that felt more like an inquisition than a presentation, and on the appointed day, the three of them, Favreau, Pierre, and Elise, arrived with their carefully crated evidence, their hearts pounding, their faces masks of calm professionalism that barely concealed the torrent of anxiety beneath, walking into a room where a dozen of the greatest minds in France sat around a long mahogany table, their expressions a mixture of bored curiosity, polite skepticism, and, in the case of a few older members, open impatience at what they assumed was a waste of their valuable time. Favreau began not with a bang, but with a whisper, laying out the groundwork with the dispassionate tone of a field report, discussing the anomalous meteorological readings he had correlated from the retreat, the bizarre compass deviations recorded by Lefebvre, the theoretical framework of self-organizing low-temperature plasma, building a slow, meticulous case that appealed to the physicists in the room, drawing them in with the language of mathematics and physics, making the impossible seem, if not yet plausible, then at least worthy of intellectual engagement. Then he introduced Pierre, not as a hysterical survivor, but as a primary observer and data point. And Pierre, his voice initially shaky but growing stronger as he spoke, delivered his testimony, describing the advance of the mist, the absolute silence, the sensation of being studied, the return to find the army gone, his words stark, simple, and utterly compelling in their raw honesty, and when he finished, the room was silent, but the quality of the silence had changed from boredom to uneasy fascination. It was Elise who then presented Lefebvre's journal, passing around carefully made copies of his sketches and notes, the precise, technical observations of a trained engineer providing a powerful corroboration of Pierre's emotional account, bridging the gap between anecdote and data. Then came the physical evidence. Favreau unveiled the relics, placing the French army buttons, the scrap of blue wool, the rusted bayonet, and the frozen leather boot on the table before the astonished academics, and finally, the piece de resistance, the ice samples under glass, which he then subjected to a weak electrical charge, causing the embedded patterns to glow with that faint, unmistakable blue light. A demonstration that caused several members to lean forward in their chairs, their eyes wide with disbelief. The room was now electric with a tense, bewildered energy. The scientists were hooked, their rational worldviews cracking under the weight of the evidence. Then, Favreau dimmed the lamps. "And now, gentlemen," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "the primary visual data." He projected the developed glass plate onto a white sheet hung on the wall. The image that bloomed into existence was grainy, haunted, and utterly undeniable. The cursed grove, the trees encased in their impossible, patterned ice, and there, in the background, the tall, slender, crystalline figure, its form shimmering with an otherworldly light. A collective, sharp intake of breath filled the room. One older academic scoffed. "A trick of the light! A double exposure!" But his voice lacked conviction. The image was too strange, too precise, too real. For a long moment, there was only stunned silence. Then, the questions began, not accusations, but genuine, frantic, bewildered inquiries. What is its composition? What is the energy source? How does it maintain cohesion? Is it a life form or a meteorological phenomenon? Favreau did his best to answer, weaving his theory of the sentient plasma, the predator of chaos, the archivist of silence. The session stretched for hours, the initial skepticism transforming into a heated, exhilarating, and terrified debate about the very foundations of science and nature. They had done it. They had made them believe. Or at least, they had made them doubt their disbelief profoundly. But as the meeting finally broke up, with promises of further study, of forming a committee, of securing funding for a proper expedition, a notion that made Pierre's blood run cold, Favreau was approached by a man who had been sitting quietly in the corner, taking notes, a government observer from the Ministry of Police, his presence a reminder that in Napoleon's France, even science was never truly free of politics. The man, impeccably dressed and with cold, calculating eyes, complimented Favreau on a most stimulating presentation. But his tone was laced with a menacing ambiguity. "The Emperor," the man said softly, "is deeply invested in a narrative of national resilience and recovery. A story of heroic sacrifice against the elements and a treacherous foe. Your discovery is fascinating, but it is also deeply disruptive. It introduces a variable that cannot be controlled, a fear that cannot be mobilized for the war effort. I would advise you, for your own sake and for the sake of your assistants, to be very, very careful with whom you share this truth. The Empire has a great capacity for silence of its own making." The threat was clear, elegant, and terrifying. They had succeeded in breaking through the wall of scientific skepticism, only to find a taller, more dangerous wall of political expediency waiting on the other side. Their evidence was not a key to liberation, it was a liability. They had made noise, and the government's response was to threaten to silence them. As they packed their evidence back into its crates, the triumphant high of their scientific victory evaporated, replaced by a cold dread. They had awakened the curiosity of the scholars, but they had also attracted the attention of the state. And the state, like the silence itself, knew how to make inconvenient things disappear. Their quest was not over. It had just entered a new, more dangerous phase, a battle not for belief, but for survival against the very powers they had hoped to enlighten. The noise had been made. Now, they had to survive the echo of their revealed truth, a sound wave of paradigm-shattering knowledge that had rippled through the rarefied air of the Institut de France, did not dissipate into the intellectual ether as they might have hoped but was instead captured, contained, and weaponized by the cold, efficient machinery of the state, transforming their hard-won scientific victory into a precarious and deadly game of cat and mouse where they were no longer the hunters of a mysterious phenomenon but the hunted, their every move monitored by the unseen eyes of Fouché's Ministry of Police, their magnificent evidence now a ticking time bomb that both they and the government sought to control, a situation that turned Favreau's mansion from a sanctuary of learning into a gilded prison under a soft siege, where the creak of a floorboard at night could be the house settling or an agent planting listening devices, and where every stranger who paused to look at the house might be a curious academic or a spy sent to report on their activities. The promised follow-up committee from the Institute never materialized. Instead, a series of polite, officious letters arrived, citing scheduling conflicts and the need for further internal review. A clear indication that political pressure had been applied from the highest levels to quarantine their discovery, to bury it under a mountain of bureaucratic inertia and whispered warnings in the ears of the Institute's leadership about patriotism, stability, and the dangers of spreading unfounded panic among a population already reeling from defeat. The threat from the government observer was not an empty one. 2 days after the presentation, Favreau received a summons to the Tuileries Palace, not to meet with the Emperor himself, but with a sleek, dangerous functionary from the Ministry of the Interior who, over cups of excessively sweetened coffee, made it abundantly clear that continued pursuit of this Siberian fantasy would be considered not merely unpatriotic, but a seditious act undermining national morale during a time of war, and that the authorities would be compelled to take all necessary measures to ensure such destabilizing theories did not reach the public, a phrase that carried the unmistakable chill of arrest warrants, confiscation, and a one-way trip to a forgotten oubliette in the Temple prison. Pierre and Elise, meanwhile, felt the pressure in more subtle, insidious ways. A gendarme began to be permanently stationed at the end of their street, not obviously watching their door, but always present, a constant reminder of the state's gaze. Their requests for travel documents to return to Languedoc were lost, and then denied on vague security grounds, and when Pierre ventured out to a cafe to buy a newspaper, he was jostled by a rough-looking man who slipped a note into his pocket. That read simply, "Forget Russia. Forget everything. Or she will forget you." A threat aimed with surgical precision at his greatest vulnerability, Elise. The message was terrifyingly clear. They were to cease all work, destroy their evidence, and never speak of the vanishing army again, or the full weight of the imperial police state would descend upon them, erasing their lives as completely as the silence had erased the army. Trapped, isolated, and living under the constant hum of threat, their initial despair began to curdle into a hardened, desperate resolve. They had not come this far, had not stared into the face of an alien intelligence and survived, only to be silenced by a bureaucrat with a taste for sweet coffee and political preservation. If the official channels were closed to them, they would have to find another way. It was Elise, her mind sharpened by adversity, who first voiced the dangerous alternative. "They want to silence us to keep the people calm," she said, her voice low and steady as they huddled in Favreau's library, the curtains drawn against the prying eyes of the street. "But what if the people already know? Not the details, not the science, but the story? Not as a fact, but as a legend. Soldiers' tales are already spreading, you said so yourself, Pierre. Whispers of a white devil in the east. What if we don't try to convince the scientists and the ministers? What if we give the story to the people? To the poets, the pamphleteers, the singers in the taverns? A story, once it's loose among the people, is a thing the police cannot catch and cage. It becomes a ghost. It can be everywhere at once." It was a radical, dangerous idea, to bypass the elite entirely and seed the truth into the fertile ground of popular culture, to transform the terrifying scientific reality of the Beloy Malchanai into a folktale, a cautionary myth, a piece of the national subconscious that would ensure the vanished men were never truly forgotten, even if the official record erased them. Favreau was initially horrified, seeing it as a betrayal of scientific rigor, a descent into sensationalism. But even he had to admit that the government's stranglehold on official discourse left them with no other weapons. "We would have to be careful," he mused, his fingers drumming on his desk. "We cannot reveal the full evidence. We cannot speak of the photographs or the samples. We must give them the essence of the story, the mist, the silence, the disappearance, and let them shape it into something that can survive. We must create a myth that contains the truth, like a nut inside a shell." And so, they began their most dangerous work yet, not a scientific presentation, but an act of cultural sabotage. Using Favreau's extensive network of contacts in the Parisian underworld, printers who operated without official permits, balladmongers who sang in the markets, playwrights who worked in the scandalous theaters of the Boulevard du Temple, they began to leak a sanitized, mythologized version of the story. Pierre, drawing on his own memories and the campfire tales of the veterans, worked with a hack writer to produce a sensationalized pamphlet titled The Ghost Army of the Berezina, a soldier's true account of Napoleon's Lost Legion, which carefully omitted the sentient creature and the scientific details, focusing instead on the eerie mist, the supernatural silence, and the mysterious vanishing of Marshal Ney's brave regard, a story presented as a spooky folktale but with the chilling ring of authenticity. Elise, using her knowledge of local melodies, adapted a popular drinking song, turning it into a mournful ballad about a lover waiting for a soldier who would never return because he had been taken by the white silence, a tune that was soon being hummed in workshops and sung in taverns. They were careful, never dealing with the same person twice, always using intermediaries, and their efforts were fueled by a small portion of Favreau's fortune, distributed in coin to hungry artists who asked no questions. For a week, nothing happened. The police surveillance continued. Then, the echo they had planted in the streets began to return to them, amplified and transformed. They heard a street vendor hawking the pamphlet on the Pont Neuf. They overheard two washerwomen by the Seine gossiping about the silent mist that eats soldiers. A popular mime at the Funambules Theatre incorporated a bit where he was pursued and then vanished by a ghostly, silent figure. The story was out. It was no longer their truth. It was becoming Paris's truth. The government's response was swift and brutal. The pamphlets were seized by the police, the printers arrested, and a new official decree was posted condemning the spread of false and inflammatory rumors designed to weaken the spirit of the nation. The pressure on them intensified. The gendarme on the corner was joined by another. They received a second, more direct warning, a dead crow, its neck broken, left on the doorstep of the mansion one morning. The state was tightening its grip, and it was only a matter of time before they were arrested on some trumped-up charge. They were running out of time. Their cultural insurgency had been a spark, but it was being smothered under the boot of censorship. They needed a bigger stage, a louder voice, a way to shout their truth so loudly that it could not be silenced. And it was then, in their darkest hour, that they received an unexpected and terrifying message, delivered not by a police spy, but by a means that made all their previous fears seem trivial. Pierre awoke one morning to find his window pane covered, on the outside, in a delicate, complex pattern of frost. It was a bright, sunny morning, too warm for frost. And the pattern was not random. It was one of the exact, non-Euclidean geometries from the Cursed Grove. The silence had found them. It was in Paris. And it was leaving them a calling card. The game had changed utterly. They were no longer just fighting a human government. The phenomenon itself had entered the fray. Their truth had not just attracted the attention of the state, it had summoned the very subject of their story. The final, apocalyptic act was about to begin. The final, apocalyptic act, heralded by the silent, glacial signature etched upon Pierre's windowpane, did not arrive with the thunder of cannons or the clamor of mobs but with a creeping, pervasive alteration of the very atmosphere of Paris itself, a subtle yet profound shift that began in the days following the frost pattern's appearance, a change that only the three of them, Pierre, Elise, and Favreau, their senses honed by trauma and knowledge, could fully perceive, a sense of being trapped within a vast, invisible laboratory where they were both the experimenters and the test subjects, with the ultimate arbiter of their hypothesis now present in the city and observing the results of their actions with its terrifying, dispassionate curiosity. The first sign was the silencing of the sparrows, the constant, cheerful chirping of the thousands of birds that nested in the city's eaves and squares, a sound so fundamental to Parisian life that it was part of the city's very breath, simply ceased, not gradually, but overnight, leaving the dawns unnervingly quiet, an absence noted and commented upon with puzzled shrugs by the citizens, who attributed it to a change in the weather or a strange migration, but for the trio, it was a chillingly familiar portent, the first note in a silent symphony of erasure. Then came the localized cold spots. They would be walking down a bustling street, surrounded by the noise of the crowd, and would suddenly step into a pocket of air so cold it made them gasp, a sphere of winter perhaps 10 feet across where the sound of the city became muffled and distant, and then they would step out of it again, back into the warmth and noise, the transition so abrupt it felt like crossing a threshold between two different worlds. And they would look back to see ordinary Parisians passing through the same space entirely unaware, shivering slightly but blaming a draft, their unseeingness more frightening to Pierre than the cold itself. The entity was not attacking, it was sampling. It was tasting the chaos of Paris, sipping at the immense, roaring noise of the metropolis, and its methods of measurement were these silent, invisible bubbles of pure entropy reversal that it was deploying throughout the city like a gardener testing the soil in different patches of a vast garden. And the realization that they were living inside an experiment being conducted by an intelligence capable of manipulating local reality on a microscopic scale was a psychological torment far greater than any political threat. Favreau, in a state of frantic, terrified exhilaration, tried to document these events, setting up his instruments throughout the house, but the phenomena were random, unpredictable, and his measurements were frustratingly inconclusive, showing only brief, massive dips in temperature and a bizarre dampening of acoustic waves that defied all known physics. Data points that would be dismissed as instrument error by any other scientist, but to them, it was proof positive that the Beloy Malchini was among them, a ghost in the machine of the city. The government's surveillance, meanwhile, became overtly hostile. The soft siege hardened into a blatant blockade, with 4 agents now permanently stationed outside the mansion's gate, following them everywhere, their presence a constant reminder that the human threat was still very real and was now operating in terrifying ignorance of the metaphysical threat growing in their midst. The state was trying to silence a story about a silencer, utterly unaware that the subject of the story was now in the room with them, irony so dark it was almost comical. The pressure from both fronts, the ever-present police and the ever-observing entity, created an unbearable tension within the house, a pressure cooker environment where every creak was either a spy or a sign of the silence, and it was under this immense strain that Favreau, his brilliant mind stretched to its breaking point, conceived of a plan so audacious, so dangerous, that it was either the work of a genius or a madman. They would not wait for the entity to act or for the police to arrest them. They would force a confrontation. They would create an event so loud, so chaotic, so full of the very energy the entity was drawn to, that they would compel it to manifest not in a hidden grove or a fleeting cold spot, but publicly, in front of witnesses that even the government could not ignore or silence. "We will give it a feast it cannot refuse," Favreau whispered, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of terror and fanatical purpose. "We will stage a presentation of our findings not for the Institute, but for the people. An open-air lecture. In the Place du Carrousel, right under the windows of the Tuileries. We will use the relics, the stories, everything. We will draw a crowd. We will create a focal point of noise and chaos so intense it will be irresistible to it. And when it comes, when it reveals itself to the people of Paris, then the truth will be seen, and no amount of police can erase what thousands have witnessed with their own eyes." Pierre and Elise were horrified. The plan was to use a crowd of innocents as bait, to deliberately attract a force they knew could erase hundreds of people in an instant, all for the sake of proving a point. It was a monstrous gamble, playing with lives on a scale that dwarfed the battlefield. But Favreau was relentless. His scientific curiosity now mutated into a monomaniacal obsession with witnessing the phenomenon at its full power, of finally capturing its ultimate manifestation on film and in the minds of the public. "We have no choice," he argued, his voice rising to a hysterical pitch. "The government will lock us away and destroy the evidence. The entity is already here, studying, sampling. It is only a matter of time before it decides to conduct a larger experiment, one we cannot predict or control. This way, we control the variables. We choose the time and place. We force its hand on our terms." The ethical dilemma was paralyzing. Were they protectors of truth or were they becoming monsters, willing to sacrifice lives for that truth? As they argued in hushed, frantic tones, the entity itself seemed to weigh in. That evening, as they sat in the library, a sudden, intense cold spot enveloped the entire room. The fire and the grate guttering down to embers without smoke, the sound of their own voices vanishing into a profound silence that lasted for a full 30 seconds, during which time the same intricate frost patterns from the window pane bloomed across the surface of Favreau's desk, a silent, unmistakable message of encouragement, or a warning, or simply a statement of impending arrival. The entity was bored with sampling. It was ready for the main course. It was agreeing to Favreau's plan. With hearts heavy with dread and a sense of fatalistic inevitability, They began their preparations, moving like automatons under the dual gaze of the police and the silence.